welcome back to my channel. I'm finally doing my January wrap-up. Yoo-hoo! So in the month of January, I had a rather ambitious TBR, and surprisingly enough, not only I finished most of those books, well, almost all of them, and I actually read more than I anticipated. Since I have quite a few books to talk about, let's just get on with it. And the first book that I read in January was actually a graphic novel, Goliath by Tom Gold. Tom Gold is quite a known illustrator and comic artist. He does comic strips for the Guardian newspaper, and you probably have seen those floating around. He has a rather distinctive art style, so you'll probably recognize those images. This one was not just a collection of comic strips compared to, for example, You're All Jealous of My Jetpack, which I really enjoyed. This one was just a whole story about David and Goliath, told from a perspective of Goliath. And in this story, Goliath is portrayed as a gentle giant. So there is a lot of kind of humor in the story, but at the same time, since we all know how the story ends with David conquering Goliath, it was a bit sad at the very end, and I did not really expect it from Tom Gold. Well, I mean, I read his Moon Cub, which was sad, but it was also very cute, but it was not in the same way sad as Goliath was. I kind of liked Goliath, but at the same time I did not. I gave it only 3 stars because I felt that taking a story which is well known for its infamous ending and just giving us sort of a hope as a reader to get to know Goliath better and kind of like him as a character, and then by the end of it he has to die, I felt that it was very unfortunate. But I still enjoyed the art and some small witticism, so to say, in his graphic novels. So yeah, I enjoyed it, but only 3 stars. The second book that I read in January was actually the book that I had on my TBR, and that was A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. That was an audiobook as read by Stephen Fry, and recently, as a matter of fact only last year, Audible has released a complete collection of Sherlock Holmes stories, and I decided to revisit the world, the canon stories, and just listen to them in audio. And my goal was to listen to only A Study in Scarlet, which I have probably done so many times. I listened to different versions of it in audio, and obviously I read the story as well. I'm not even mentioning all the TV shows that I watched, but that was the story that I read. Probably it was the first story about Sherlock Holmes that I read, and I remember reading it as a kid. And probably like a lot of my peers, I read the first part of it and then completely skipped over the second part because I found it really boring. Listening to it in audio really helped, and I think this was the very first time when I actually got into the second part of the story as much as I did into the first one. It was a very pleasurable listen. I loved it. I love Stephen Fry and I love Sherlock Holmes, so obviously I gave it 5 stars. However, I did not stop there and continued with the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I did not have any set goal for the month. I just wanted to listen to one story, and for that I picked A Study in Scarlet, but I couldn't stop. I continued listening, and I went through 10 out of 12 stories from the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I skipped the first one, which is A Scandal in Bohemia, and I listened to up till the Copper Beaches, and I stopped there and then continued in February. But obviously I gave every single story 5 stars since it's one of my favorites. There is no, doubt in there. Next book that I read in January was actually a picture book, and I picked it up on a whim from NetGalley. It was an ARC, as a matter of fact. The book was called Patra, and it was illustrated and written by Mariana Calpo. This is a children's book, so obviously it was extremely short, and that was a story of Patra, and Patra is a rock, and she's not just an ordinary rock, she's a rock that wants to be different things. One day she decides to be an an egg, and then she decides to be an island, and then so on and so forth. What I liked about this story is that it tells the idea to children about how you can be pretty much anything you want, and I really liked that message. However, I felt that the book was extremely short. It's about 20 pages cover to cover, so probably there are like maybe 16 pages of text itself, maybe even less actually, but I felt that it was extremely short. The artwork is very cute, it's very reminiscent of watercolors. I found it very adorable, but I gave it only 4 stars because I felt that the whole message about you can be anything you want could have been expanded a bit more, because the story ends with the girl kind of catching or finding this rock and taking it home. And I kind of felt that they might have created a bit more images pertaining to this topic. However, it's just my opinion. I don't have any kids. I don't really have anyone in my immediate circle of friends who would have kids of this particular age. But if you do have kids who would benefit from children's book like that, I would definitely recommend you check this one out. And I'll provide the information down below because I'm not sure if it's out yet or if it's coming out in April. I might be mistaken, but I'll provide the link down below. Matter of fact, as always, in my description box down below, I will have links to the Goodreads reviews or reviews on my blog. So I try to expand a bit more in my written reviews, and if you're interested, you're more than welcome to check them out. Next, I listened to an audiobook called Aftermath by Chuck Vendig, and that was book number 1 in his Star Wars Aftermath trilogy. I picked it up on a whim because I watched The Last Jedi and I really wanted to kind of be in that world of Star Wars a bit longer, and while browsing Wikipedia for something related to Star Wars, I came across a couple of adult Star Wars novels and I realized that they were available in audio, so I went and picked one from the library. What attracted me to this particular trilogy was the fact that, first of all, it takes place between episode 6. So this is the episode in which Darth Vader is, as well as Emperor Palpatine, are basically killed off or conquered, whatever you want to use the word for it, and the Force Awakens episode 7. So we have quite a huge gap in time between those 2 episodes, and this is a trilogy that kind of expands on what happened in between. Obviously, we do have mentions of all of the characters that we have in the original Star Wars episodes: Princess Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, etc. But we also have a whole band of new characters. It's a very unlikely group of people. We have an ex-Imperial loyalty officer, we have one of the pilots for the New Republic, we have her son, we have a bounty hunter. We just have a whole bunch of new characters and how they all come together and just go on different adventures. But this first book was mostly about us getting to know those characters and their individual plot lines and how they all came together. This audiobook was narrated by Mark Thompson, who does a freaking amazing job. He's so good in creating all different voices for all of the characters. There has never been a point in the story when I would doubt what kind of character is talking. Plus, and I don't know if it's typical for only Star Wars, or maybe it is typical for sci-fi novels as well, translated into audio, but there are a lot of additional sounds that are added to the story. So all of the space warp, fights, spaceships, etc., etc. So it really adds to the whole experience. I loved Mark Thompson. By the way, if you don't know, Mark Thompson was also part of the Nimona audiobook, and as well as Jonathan Davis, who narrated Rogue One Catalyst, another Star Wars movie, and he was also Nimona. And it took me a while. I was actually very surprised because I'm pretty good with voices, and it took me a while to realize that Mark Thompson why his voice was kind of very familiar to me, especially when he was voicing Sinjir. And I was like, why? And then I realized that I heard him before in Nimona. And I highly recommend this audiobook if you're a Star Wars fan. However, I gave it only 4 stars. Reason for that being because it is very cliched. Let's just be honest. There are certain things that are written pretty well, and it does everything like weaves together really well in terms of the plot, construction. There are a lot of references to the Star Wars worlds and planets, etc. So it's very coherent and very well done. However, there are just so many cliches. For example, some of the chapters would end with a very typical cliffhanger that is, I would say, probably is better works in a movie when you see like flashes of one scene and it goes into the other scene. For example, like a chapter might, or a scene of fighting might interrupt in the middle and then flick to something else like it does in the movies, but in the book it's kind of weird. I don't know, it's my opinion. I still loved it, but I give it only 4 stars. Next book that I finished was Royal Bastards by Andrew Schwartz, and it took me ages to finish this book. Actually, I originally picked it up from the library in, I want to say October or maybe November, and I had to return it because I read 100 pages and then just got distracted by something else, not because the book was bad, but because I was just distracted. And then I finally picked it up again, decided to finish it, and the problem with this book was that when I was reading it, I was really enjoying it, but however, when I put it aside, I never really had an inclination to pick it up again. So this is a YA fantasy. I believe it's book number 1 in a trilogy. We have the main protagonist, a 16-year-old girl by the name Tila, who is an illegitimate daughter of the Lord of Kent. She also has a half-brother, Jax. She spent basically all of her life trying to win love and admiration of her father, but she is just a bastard daughter, right? So she cannot be a legitimate heir to throne or whatever, the head of the Kent County, I believe it was. So one day there is a huge feast that takes place in that land, and the royal princess is invited to that feast, as well as representatives from some other lands, and they have a specific table which is reserved for bastards only. So Tila is there, her brother is there, some other people are there, but what is surprising is that the royal princess decides to join them at the table because she wants to be closer to common people. And from that point, Tila decides to befriend this princess and maybe go on a little adventure. And while they're adventuring and discovering different tunnels underneath the castle, they stumble upon a very major event that is essentially an act of treason. And 5 of them, there are a whole bunch of different teenagers, all bastards except for the princess. They stumble upon this event, and since they're witnesses, they're being immediately haunted by pretty much everyone. So they go off on adventure trying to both protect the princess and also escape and warn some other lords, etc., etc. I'm not very good at summarizing this book because the plot itself is kind of vague. While I was reading that, I had trouble to retain why they were doing what they were doing. Yes, of course, they witnessed a very big event, which was treason, so they're running away, and supposedly people think that they kidnapped or killed the princess, which is also an act of treason. So they're being persecuted. But at the same time, like it's very difficult to understand why they're doing that. The book is written in a very lighthearted way, which is a very big bonus, because while reading this book I was never bored. I think the dialogues are the strongest part of this book, as there are so many amazing dialogues and so many amazing comebacks, you know, and jokes, etc. However, the problem with this book is that it is essentially a fantasy story, but the characters themselves and how cliched they are is very reminiscent of a contemporary YA. So we have a popular girl, and we have a boy next door stereotype, and we have a trope of like a bad boy with a heart of gold. So we also have like a nerdy kid. You know, it was just a bit too tropey for me. I thought it was fun. However, while reading this book, I was just like, I don't really understand why this is happening. It's just like there was no substance to the plot, in my opinion. And by the time we got to probably the last 50 pages, that was the time when fun started to happen, when they were not just traveling, but there was some big action happening. And I really enjoyed that part, basically the ending of the book. But overall, I was slightly disappointed. I still intend to continue with the series, but I gave this book only 3 stars. It is a debut novel. Not every single writer is capable of writing a smashing debut, but I thought it was a bit just too cliched, especially in those tropes when, for example, someone is traveling somewhere and then someone gets injured and someone conveniently finds everything that needs to be used to dress a wound in some saddle bag that they found on a horse, and then turns out that one of the characters supposedly has capability of sewing together a wound. It was just a bit too much for me, plus there was a lot of telling instead of showing. But if you want to read more in-depth thoughts, I'll provide the link down below. Overall, I give this book 3 stars. However, there is another thing that I want to mention. I picked this book up originally because it was listed under diversity in YA on Indigo website. Ever since I picked this book up and I read it, it was removed from that section, but I remember seeing it there quite distinctively. Obviously, I have no proof, but I remember it seen somewhere under LGBT tag. However, this book does not have LGBT relationship or theme whatsoever. There is one very minor character who appears by the end of the book who is cited to be gay, but that was just one mention and it has absolutely zero impact on the story, and it's not mentioned again. So if you, for some reason, think that this book has LGBT characters, just please be aware of that. January was pretty good month on audiobooks, especially because while listening to something like Aftermath by Chuck Vendick, I felt that I needed a break from all sci-fi and fighting, so I picked up something on a whim from Overdrive and decided to listen to contemporary, and that was Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by J.C. Andrews. And I hated this book. Oh god, I hated this book so freaking much, I cannot even tell you. I struggled through this audiobook because I could not care less about the characters or the plot or anything that was happening. If you don't know the plot of this book, I'll give it to you very quickly. So we have 2 friends. We have the main protagonist, and I don't even remember his name. Oh, his name is Greg. So we have the main protagonist by the name of Greg, and we have Earl, his best friend, and how they just go about their days and talking mostly shit to each other. There is a lot of swearing in this book. I did not expect that, and even though I do know that teenagers swear, and god, of course I swear it myself, I still do, it was just a bit too much for me. Plus, in some ways, especially since they befriend a girl who's dying from leukemia, it did remind me of The Fault in Our Stars, but when The Fault in Our Stars is this epic, romancy, fairy tale about 2 star-crossed lovers, essentially, this one is just very gritty, down-to-earth. It's supposed to be funny. I did not find any jokes funny there. I might have snorted just once, but it just was not funny whatsoever for me. I don't know why people like this book. I picked it up about 2 years ago, I think, when the movie came out, and I thought, oh, it might be a fun contemporary to read. God, I'm so glad I listened to that in audio because I just could listen to it while doing something else. But reading this, I just no, I gave this book 2 stars. I think it was just a waste of time. Personally, not my thing whatsoever. I know that I do struggle with contemporaries, but this one was just too boring. None of the characters experience any sort of character development. We don't really have anyone who's likable enough, at least for myself, and the plot is pointless. It's so pointless. It's just... I liked Earl way more than I liked Greg because he seemed to be a bit more compassionate in certain ways, but it's just the whole story. It's... no. Just no. I give it 2 stars. It's written fairly well, but not my thing. I will be unhauling this book for sure. And the next book that I read in January was This Is How We Got Here by Keith Barker. This is actually a play, and it was provided to me by Playwrights Canada Press in exchange of a free and honest review. I was also very fortunate to be invited to the launch party for the fall releases in October, and I got to meet Keith Barker there and also at the individual release of this play, and I actually got it signed. So this is the play about a very close-knit family that experiences acute loss. We have 2 main protagonists and also an aunt and an uncle, and they're all grieving the loss of a boy who committed a suicide. This is the story that is partially based on Keith's own experience and experience of loss, especially when it comes to losing someone to mental health and to suicide. And this is a very well written play. I think it's one of the easiest, in spite of the topic, easiest plays that I have ever read. First of all, it captures the inability to express emotion and pain and grief very well. We have 2 protagonists, mother and father, who both suffer from the loss of their child, and they experience it in very different ways. We also have an uncle and an aunt who basically ignore this whole issue, and they refuse to talk about it, about the fact that someone is dead, and this is how they're trying to deal with it. There is a reason why the fox is on the cover. Personally, when I picked up this play, I thought that the fox was just, it was just a cover, but actually there is a reason why the fox is there, and there is a fox in the story, which made me very happy. But I think it's a very well written play. I was so fortunate to be able to hear Keith himself read parts of this play, and I think later on when I was reading the play itself, I could hear his voice in my head while he was reading for 2 main male characters. I absolutely loved his voice and the way he was reading for them. Absolutely loved this play. It's not easy, but it's a very true and honest portrayal of how people deal with loss and grief, and also raises awareness to mental health and suicide overall. So I gave this play 4.55 stars. I honestly really enjoyed it, and I can see myself reading it again. One of my favorite lines, and that's a very good sign if I have a favorite line, was, and I felt it kind of resonated with me as well. It is said by the aunt. Her name is Lisette, and she says, she's talking to her sister, the one who lost her child, and she says, "What you're doing here, you cannot do that. The egg is just an egg. There is no meaning behind any of it, so please don't start looking for something that isn't there. I know you're sad. I'm sad too. That's why I made dinner." So it's just resonated with me for some reason. I really enjoyed this play, and if you enjoy reading Canadian literature and if you enjoy reading plays, I do recommend you pick this one up. It might be a bit triggering for some people just because of the subject matter, but it's so well written, I think it's worth it. Next, I have a book that I did not really plan to read in January, but after watching Emma's video on, I think it was her Diversity Bingo wrap-up, and she mentioned this book, and I saw that it was available as an audiobook and as a book from a library, and I picked it up, and this is Under Rose-Tainted Skies by Louise Garnell. So this is a YA contemporary book, which has a very strong and true and powerful depiction of mental illness, and specifically agoraphobia. So the main protagonist, Nora, suffers from agoraphobia to the point that she cannot really leave the house. She's a teenager, so obviously when a boy moves next door, she's immediately attracted to him, and as their relationship develops, she's haunted by the thoughts of how they can develop their relationship at all if she struggles with anxiety and OCD and agoraphobia, and she cannot even leave the house, not to mention go on a date or do anything fun. So I picked this book completely on a whim, and the moment I started to listen to it as an audiobook, I was just captivated. It's not a very long audiobook. I think it's about 8 hours only, and it's a very fast-paced read. I just couldn't put it down. Well, couldn't stop listening to it. I really enjoyed the narrator and the way she portrayed Nora. I think this is a very well overall portrayal of mental illness, especially anxiety. The story is told from Nora's perspective, so we get very close and personal with her illness and how it affects her life and everyone around her. The cast of supporting characters is amazing. We have a very loving and understanding mother. We have a very nice psychiatrist, and also the boy next door by the name of Luke, I believe. He's also very nice and supporting, and this is absolutely phenomenal because there are so many books in YA contemporary that have very strong teenage characters, but supporting characters like family members or siblings or friends, sometimes they're not as well portrayed, or their function is very superficial one and they do not really play that strong of a role. But this book was very well written overall. I give this book 4.25 stars, and the reason for that being it's contemporary, and as always I struggle with contemporaries. It was very tropey in the sense that we have a girl who falls in love with the boy next door, and there are a lot of tropes surrounding that, and the book basically follows a very similar pattern to all contemporary romances, but the depiction of mental illness and how it affects and basically affects every aspect of Nora's life is phenomenal. I absolutely loved it. More so, this book is on voices because the author also suffers from agoraphobia, which you can basically tell when you read this book, since it does have this very true feeling to the story. Absolutely loved it. Now I want to talk about something else. And I mentioned this in my review that I will provide the link to down below. I felt that this book was very reminiscent of Everything by Nicola Yoon. When I read Everything about 2 years ago, I gave it 5 stars, which I now realize is a bit too of a higher rating for that book, not because I did not enjoy it or because I didn't think it was a very well-written debut novel, but because the way everything is constructed and the way the plot is, and the essence of plot, it might be harmful to people who live with chronic illnesses and disabilities. And I did not even realize it or think about it while I was reading the book, because the part of the story which is very unique to Everything resonated with me on a specific level. I don't want to mention it. I don't want to say exactly why. First of all, because it's personal, and secondly, because it will spoil the plot of Everything. But I felt that it really resonated with me on a certain level. However, I gave that book 5 stars, and now, especially since I have read this one, which is very similar in the sense that we have a girl who lives inside a house and she cannot leave it, plus she falls in love with a boy who lives next door. And this book is very true and very honest in depiction of agoraphobia and anxiety and mental illness, that I think that this book holds more value. And I'm sorry, I don't really mean to say this, but it's just Everything was a very exciting debut, so lovely. I met Nicola Yoon and I liked her, and I think she's a good writer. However, her book, I don't know if I have a word for it, but I feel that Everything does not bring as much awareness and value as does Under Rose-Tainted Skies. That's why I have to lower my rating for Everything Everything, and I'm giving it 4 stars because I absolutely adore that book. But this one deserves a bit more. That's why 4.25. It's a bit of a weird situation for me because usually I don't go back and change the rating on books that I read. I do intend to give a slightly higher rating at first once I finish the book because I'm just riding high on all emotions, and Everything Everything as a book was fantastic. I did not really like the movie, to be honest. I felt that it was just a bit too cliched. I don't know. But I just feel that this book deserves more love and praise. It's a bit difficult matter to talk about, but this is my decision, and I highly recommend you read this book. Next, I have a book that I mentioned in my January TBR as a sort of wild card book, and the reason for that being because at the point when I was filming that TBR video, I did not have this book on hand. And this is The Wolves of Winter by Tyrell Johnson. And this book was provided to me very kindly by Simon & Schuster of Canada, as well as Indigo, because I was invited to the Indigo's book club meeting talk thing. This is a debut novel set in the winter of Yukon, and this is a very interesting story because it is dystopian, but it's not a very typical dystopian. When you think of dystopians, you think of Divergent, of Hunger Games, or something very fantastical happening. In this book, the world collapsed, not because of something fantastical or I don't know, but it was just the Third World War erupted between big countries. Everyone started to bomb each other, and then there was an outbreak of terminal disease, and there is one family that essentially just escapes from their home. First in Chicago, they moved to Alaska, and then they moved to Yukon, trying to get away from the collapsing world and collapsing civilization, as well as that terminal disease. The main protagonist of the story is Lynn. She lives together with her mother, a friend of her father, as well as her brother and another boy. And somewhere in the middle of the forest, they learned how to hunt with arrows and bows, how to skin animals, how to get through the winter. They live in a very simplified world where basically nothing exists. They don't have cell phones, they don't have... Basically, they have nothing. They have to come up with their own things. They have to cook very simple things. They have to grow vegetables. They basically have to learn how to live on their own without any civilization whatsoever. And the story starts with Lynn hunting, and then one day she encounters a stranger. That stranger comes to their little settlement, basically that consists of 5 people, and brings a lot of questions and danger with him. I loved this book. It is a absolutely crazy fast-paced read. It's so well written for a debut novel. It's unbelievable. There are a lot of interesting literary references in this book as well, and I got to mention one of them to the author, and he was actually very surprised, which pleased me to no end because apparently I was the only person who picked on that. I don't know how or why, but I really enjoyed this book. I felt that this was a very well and written and constructed story, extremely believable, because we have these vivid images of hunting, of dealing with snow, with dangers of living in the forest, essentially. It's just all well written. Honestly, I was feeling chills while I was reading that because it just felt very real, and everything that was happening was very real. The beginning of the story might seem slightly slow, just maybe like first 30 pages or 50 pages, but then it just snowballs, so to say, and goes so fast-paced that the last 100 pages I just couldn't put the book down. I really enjoyed it. I give it, however, 4 stars, and there is a reason for that. I'm going to provide a spoiler alert here, so if you don't want to listen to that, please skip over it, but I feel that it's important to mention that this book starts with a sexual assault, and that was something that soured it to me, at least at the very beginning. It basically happens within the first, I don't know, like 20 pages or so. So what happens is the main protagonist is assaulted by another man in their village who is kind of like their neighbor. And I hated that part because it felt as if that assault was really unnecessary. It was not pertaining to anything. It was just showing how much of a jackass that character is, and there was really nothing to it. While we had a Q&A with the author, I mentioned this, and the author said that he did have both female and male editors, and nobody picked up on that as being unnecessary or a bit too much, so to say. But myself, as well as some other female readers in the audience, all kind of discussed it after that, and everyone mentioned that everyone felt a bit iffy about it, so to say. Just like everyone felt that it was not as necessary. But it happened, and just please be aware of that, because it is a trigger warning and might be a trigger for some people. Otherwise, you have to understand that this book shows a very simplified way of living, so there will be a lot of gore and blood and violence in it, because we're talking about hunting, we're talking about killing, and there are also like people are being killed, etc. So you have to be aware of that this book is really violent. Some people were saying that it's a YA story. I completely disagree. The main protagonist is 22 years old. She might read as something who's younger, but she's 22 years old. She's not a teenager anymore. She's an adult, and the topics in this book are very adult ones. So I do think that this is an adult book. This is, so far, a standalone. I got to ask the author whether there will be a sequel, because this book ends with a kind of an interesting ending, which can be read as either an open ending or a closed ending, but he was very tight-lipped about it. So yeah. Overall, I gave this book 4 stars, and I do recommend you check it out if you are not afraid of those particular triggers that I mentioned. But I would also like to do a thorough review of this book. I'm not sure whether I'll do a video or it will just do it on my blog, but either of those will be in the description box below. So please check it out. Next, I read Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, and this is book number 1 in the Infernal Devices trilogy. I'm finally reading Cassandra Clare, and I'm super excited about this fact. So I watch Emma from Emma's Books channel, and everyone knows that she's a huge fan of Cassandra Clare and Shadowhunters and everything that has to deal with that. I watched her video in which she suggested different ways in which order you can read the Shadowhunters books. So one of the suggestions was to start with Infernal Devices, since the books are set in the 19th century, which means that there is absolutely no way you can get spoiled for the Mortal Instruments. That's why I decided to go this way. However, I know that Cassandra Clare wrote first 3 books in the Mortal Instruments series, and then she wrote the Infernal Devices trilogy, and then she went back to writing the Mortal Instruments series. I also heard several people say that the Infernal Devices are better series or better trilogy to start with because they're better written, since they're like books 4, 5, and 6 that Cassandra Clare wrote at that point. And usually people like them more compared to the Mortal Instruments. So I was very curious. I picked this book up, and to be completely honest, I really enjoyed it, but I also had a lot of problems with it. The main problem that I had with the book was the fact that Cassandra Clare at that point wrote a trilogy which was very successful, but she still made a lot of mistakes, in my opinion, as a writer in this book. This is a fairly thick book, so it's how long is it? It's like almost 500 pages, and this is a very long book. I believe at least 100 pages could have been cut off with no damage to the plot itself, because there were some scenes that should have been condensed and they were not. Also, a lot of things that happen in the book seemed like fan service, essentially. It's not a bad thing, just don't get me wrong. I love fan fiction and I love fan service and everything that has to do with fandoms, but I had certain expectations from Cassandra Clare as an author while I was picking up the book, which was not a debut novel, and it was already a book that existed in an established world. That's why I was surprised that some parts of the novel were just too cliched, and I had a feeling as if everything that was happening in this book I read somewhere else before, which is very weird. This is definitely the first time I'm reading Cassandra Clare books. I obviously heard a lot of things about the Mortal Instruments, but since I'm very notorious about avoiding any type of spoilers, I'm pretty sure I managed to avoid all of them. But why was it similar? Like, why it felt so... basically, I was haunted by the feeling of deja vu. So weird. And then at some point I realized that there were a lot of aspects to this story that I have seen in fan fiction, not in Mortal Instruments world, but in other fandoms, say, I don't know, like Sherlock fandom or some other fandoms that talk about angels and powers and all that. I'm not trying to say that Cassandra Clare was not original. I think her books are original enough. It's just since this one was written, 5, 6, 7 years ago? Obviously, we've had other books that were very similar, and I believe also about 10 years ago there were just a lot of saturation when it comes to angels and demons and all of that, so it was not particularly new, but the way that she constructed the story, I assume, was new for the audience. Since 10 years ago, I was not reading YA. I cannot really say much, but I just know that there was definitely a period in fantasy literature, especially urban fantasy, that was just all over, you know, like angels and demons and all of this stuff. And that also affected fandom, because I've been reading fan fiction for a very long time. I haven't done that in a while, actually, but I know that when I was reading a lot of things, say 10 years ago, this is when we had all those centennials and angels and vampires. Those just like were all over the place in different fandoms. That's why while I was reading that, I had a feeling as if either Cassandra Clare came to original writing from writing fan fiction, which is awesome, and there is nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong, I'm trying to stress it here, or she just kind of felt that this was the trend that she had to write in, and she did. Also, nothing wrong with that. For me, it felt slightly cliched. I did not like Tessa. I did, however, liked male shadow hunters, and I liked the idea of Clockwork's like mechanisms or whatever they were called, like dolls, mannequins. I did like the story. I really like the setting because Victorian or close to Victorian England is one of my favorite time periods. I love the idea of everything happening in a big church, you know, very grand and impressive. I really liked it. However, like I said, I was a bit disappointed by the writing style, and I felt that at that point, Cassandra Clare should have been like, you know, such a pro in writing books that this should not be happening in this book. However, I might be wrong, and maybe her writing gets better in following books. That's a very high possibility. There's nothing wrong with that, but some of those scenes in this book were just too much of a fan service. Honestly, while I was reading certain moments, especially when we have like one of the protagonists, when we have James playing a violin, and it was just such an anime moment that I was like, I was just laughing, and it made me really happy because this is the type of story that I like. But I was also, like I said, a bit disappointed about the writing style. I still gave this book 3.5 stars. I think it's a highly entertaining read. It is more of a guilty pleasure for me as opposed to something that I would be probably very passionate about. However, I already ship James and Will. Do not judge me. This is the way I am. But anyway, I will definitely continue with the series, and I'm very excited to read more books, and I think I'm even excited to read Mortal Instruments in spite of the fact that this is a bit disappointing in style, but I think it will just be something like reading published fan fiction. Like I said, do not judge me. I really enjoyed it, but it was just not on par with what I expected. And the last but definitely not least was Island of Exiles by Erica Cameron. I was kindly provided an ARC copy of this book by Entangled Teen, and I was supposed to read it and provide a review by beginning of December. However, due to some personal reasons completely unrelated to the book, I could not do it on time, so I finished it only in January, and I did enjoy it. I had some problems with the book originally when I started reading it. I read about up till I think 25% or somewhere around that, and then I had to stop, and once I picked it up again I realized that I couldn't really get into the writing, so I decided to start from the very beginning. And I'm very glad that I did that because the world itself is very complex. There is a lot of diversity in the world, but there's also a lot of world building, which is very specific to this book. That's why it takes a while to get into the book itself. So the world is set on a sort of desert island, and everything that happens in one city. It's something like a huge citadel in which they hide from the desert outside and from the violent storms that happen outside. Our main protagonist is basically a wizard slash a warrior. Everyone, almost everyone in their city has a certain magic ability, and her ability is to move D'Souza, which is the magic power or magic matter, or something like a force, essentially. And she can move that, and she can create protective shields from it, and just do some other stuff. So her main goal in life is to advance in her society and to protect her younger brother. And everything that evolves around them two is just like her trying to make sure that he shows his magic talent, because otherwise if he doesn't, he will be cast as the lowest society member, and she does not want that for her brother. And it also means that she will not be able to see him or talk to him. The story itself is very interesting. We have raging storms outside, we have a very dangerous desert, we have unique animals and plants, we have names for different layers of society, we have names for different things, magic abilities. Oh my god, the world is very complex. I need to really hand it off to Erica because she did an amazing job in creating a very complicated world. However, this is also a downfall of this book because it takes a while to get into the story itself, since you have to learn all of the vocabulary and everything. As a matter of fact, there is glossary at the end of the book, which I did not realize, and if I knew that, it would have made my reading experience so much better. Honestly, I don't know why I never looked at the very end, but I always provided a Kindle copy, so I usually don't go to the very end of the Kindle book, you know? So the story itself is interesting, but what I liked the most about this book is diversity. Not only we have 3 official genders in this book, so we have female, male, and someone who does not identify themselves as either female or male. We have different types of sexualities which are considered to be norm and never even mentioned as something outstanding or strange or unusual. We have characters with different shades of skin. It's just overall an amazingly diverse read, which I absolutely loved, and that was probably my favorite part of the book. I did like the action, but since it took a while to develop, so to say, especially like since I think everything starts to pick up around 1/3 of the book, things start to happen, and then just action, the most of action happened probably in the last third of the book. But still, I enjoyed it. I gave it 3.5 stars just because it took me a while to get into the world. The action itself can be a bit, you know, slow, and the plot does not move as fast as it should be. I do understand that such a book that has an extensive world building requires a lot of, you know, basically showing the whole world and how it works to a reader before we can show the action. But for me, it was a downside, and I gave it only 3.5 stars. However, I was lucky to get a second book in the trilogy, and I'm super excited because I'm already reading it and really enjoying it, so I'll update you about it in my February wrap-up. I also have a more in-depth review on my blog, and I'll provide the link down below. Anyway, this is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below if you read any of the books that I mentioned, or if you plan to read any of them and what you think about my thoughts on them. Thank you so much, and I'll see you very soon. Bye! Tom Gold is a quiet no in... It's a study in Scarlet by Yes, it's Mark Thompson. Why do I even doubt myself? Oops. I cannot believe I've been filming for almost like an hour and I'm still not done. Oh my god, this video will be like an hour long. Jesus. So I watched one of her videos in which she... Where is my water? I need water.